Welcome to Hear From Where, a podcast about the journeys that shape us. I'm your host, Chef Andrew Garrett, and each week I'll sit down with incredible individuals who've carved their own paths in health, nutrition, entrepreneurship, sports, and beyond. This is where we dive deep into the stories of determination, resilience, and passion, the moments that brought them here, from where they started. Whether you're looking for inspiration, a spark to start your own journey, or just love hearing amazing stories, then you're in the right place. So grab your favorite drink, settle in, and let's explore what it really takes to follow your dreams. Hello and welcome to another episode. I think this is episode 21 of the Hear From Where podcast. I'm your host, Chef Andrew Garrett. Today I am joined by a fifth generation family farmer out of Nebraska, as well as the co-founder of Regenerate Nebraska, Graham Christensen. You all may remember him from our recording last year. Graham was one of my very first interviewees, and I am so it's crazy to me that I'm now at the point with this podcast where I get to follow up. And so today, following up with Graham and diving into some of what we got going on that is easily brushed under the table or not really a major media sensation, but in my opinion it really should be, and it's something that we should be talking more openly and loudly about, and that's the farm crisis that we're starting to get really close on top of, if not already in. Graham, thank you for joining me again. I'm excited to get into this today. How are you?
I'm doing great. Chef Garrett, it's good to see you, and thanks for the good recommendation on barbecue down in Amarillo as I was on my way through that city here recently on my way down to Lubbock, Texas.
Heck yeah. I'm so glad that you and Charles got a chance to connect because, like I was saying earlier before we got on here, is like one of the reasons why I started this podcast is to be able to, really get stories of all the really awesome people that I've had the opportunity to meet, like yourself, and then connecting you with another man who I really love and respect, Charles Carr, doing barbecue in a completely different state. And it kind of reminds me that God really does have a good plan for me. And part of that plan is connecting good people. And so that's what I really want to continue to try to do here with this. And I'm so excited. And you are a new father.
Yes.
Excellent. Congratulations. How's that going?
It's going good. Bryce Christensen's the new addition to the family. He was born in late September, right as I was about to go into the fields for harvest in a pretty serious way. But we got a good family around to kind of, keep on the up and ups. He's happy. He's smiling. It's pretty wild too. But came right into his first harvest with us at the farm. And so I'm one proud daddy.
Well, lucky for him, he's going to get to grow up celebrating his birthday during harvest. So good for him. Right on. And how was harvest this year?
Harvest was good. There definitely is it was a kind of an odd year. I think the last 5 years we were under our regular precip average, and so it was very dry. All of a sudden last year we had near record amounts of rainfall, which can be good for a lot of things, but also for some of the other crops in the area. Some of the corn that we've seen some fungus that typically isn't up here, is more contained to the south, take over some of our food grade stuff, and disallowed us to put all that into the kind of food market as we typically would. So interesting growing cycles, but we always have kind of a backup plan in place, and so everything overall worked out. But every year there's a new challenge. I had not had this specific challenge up at our farm yet, but the weather cycle is always a little bit different every year in Nebraska. So it's just what we have to be better at, is being resilient. And from our last conversation, we talked a lot about that resiliency.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things that we kind of, as the average consumer, we really don't take into consideration, is how many variables there are. It's not farming is not just, oh, you put your seeds in the ground, they grow, and then you go pick them. There are so many things. I mean, everything from the wind to the rain. When Graham says precip, we're talking about precipitation, the amount of moisture that we're seeing in the area, the animals, the insects, the pests, and when you're doing something that is in the regenerative space, you're trying to mitigate all these variables on a daily basis. It's not just in whatever comes your way, you have to be able to roll with and figure out. And so I think that's one of the really cool things. And what you guys are doing is as entrepreneurs in the farm space or in the regenerative space, and how do y'all really manage that? I mean, how do you approach those things?
Well, like, so then this year the beans did exceptionally well, arguably like some of the best beans we've grown. And of course, all the trees that I'd been planting or had been like scraggling along trying to make it through the drought, like they really popped this year, So that's the sign of why diversification is so important. We need to have more market opportunities, not less market opportunities, because not only is it better for us to spread out where we're putting our risk and what we grow, but that extra diversification that also helps us build that healthy ecosystem. And so when something doesn't grow good, you want to have some other things going on too. And I think overall as an industry, we've started to become specialists in areas, which is also kind of like leading us to that more monoculture, kind of mentality here. And that costs us a little bit more in the federal government to be able to invest in that kind of system, because we see a lot more problems probably spread through the area and as a whole, widespread, when you have a less diversified nature of agriculture. So we're trying to break that up on our little pocket, and create more rotational cycles. And this upcoming farm season, and we'll be trying a couple other things too to further diversify, which I'm excited about as well.
That's awesome. Yeah, we're coming into spring. So are you guys coming into planting season at this point?
Not quite yet. I will start, like I usually start planting some different species of trees and stuff in April, maybe late March if I get like a couple windows, but I got to be careful in case we get like a hard freeze still at that point. So April is really good time. Usually that can, that coexists with what is typically anyway a rainier season in Nebraska. That April, May, April showers bring May flowers. That's kind of like definitely how it's supposed to be typically in Nebraska. So I like to get those trees in when they're going to get a lot of that early rainfall, take some of the pressures off me watering, and then that gives them a real chance to get up. And then it gets real hot, so I just got to stay with them. But that's kind of my plan, and we are continuing that diversification in a number of ways, not just with the trees, but with some prairie grasses. We've turned last year a couple more acres back into some conservation prairie, and then we'll be actually this season taking out a cycle of soybeans on a field, and we're trying to lock in the final deal right now. So I may be preempted, but it looks like a pretty positive thing. But we're going to try to raise some waxy sorghum, which will be used for actually gluten-free cereal grains.
Yeah.
For a company that people may have seen in the grocery stores, and until it's ready, I'm not going to talk about the company name, but we're really excited about that opportunity. And then we'll go back into some food grade beans again this year, and of course, like our main staple has been in the rotation has been that non-GMO white corn for tortilla.
Dude, how cool is that? That's so exciting. I love, so a sorghum is probably something that a lot of people don't hear very often, because it hasn't been really mainstreamed through chefs and restaurants, unless you've kind of been in the vegan or vegetarian space for a while. Then you're really familiar with it. But for someone that like really comes from a heavy meat background like myself, had I not grown up in a farm setting or been around chefs who were using, things like sorghum. Sorghum's a really awesome ingredient. It's to me, it's a lot like a wheat berry in application. So like I'll toast it and then make like a risotto out of it, and they have a really cool texture. But the husk caramelizes really nice, so you get a really like kind of like robust, rich caramely flavor out of it. And I tell you what, like making like just a classic risotto style recipe, but using sorghum instead of rice is like it's a killer. Or like sorghum pilaf. Like, yeah, sorghum for everybody listening at home, and you're kind of like, okay, chef, like, we get it, like chefy stuff. Like, treat sorghum like you would rice. Yeah, and the water ratio is a little bit different, but you could really, again, toast that husk, and it makes such a great dish. Something that you touched on is farmers going into more specialized areas, and it's something that I've seen at our farmers markets probably in the last 2 or 3 years is, a lot of these farms are specializing in specific crops and then kind of having auxiliary crops around it. So, one of my farmers down here, they really specialize in cabbage. Cabbage does really well in our climate, and so they've just got cabbage all year round, and they're also kind of doing a little bit of just kind of side stuff, but where their farm stand would typically have, this plethora of all these different fruits and all these different vegetables, they're really only like the centerpiece of cabbage. Is that a problem that's occurring, or is that something that is just kind of normalizing throughout the marketplace? What do you think?
Well, when I say specialization, I'm talking about like in the early 80s, a lot of farmers, including our family, removed the cattle to specialize in crops. And those crops were a little bit more diversified because there might have been a wheat rotation, or there might have been a sorghum rotation for livestock feed back then. And so as I went forward over time, all of a sudden people are more specializing in just corn and beans, in our area. And so that's the gateway to the potential monoculture. I mean, every business should have a specialization and then build things around them. That's healthy. But what I was referring to is that as a whole, the agricultural industry per regions have specialized into only a few things instead of kept more diversified rotation. And over that time, simultaneously, there's been a lack of markets to get additional crops in certain parts of the country that were once grown as part of our rotation. In our area, like small grains, for instance, it's really tough to find a market for small grains right now. And that would be a gateway to being able to harvest something earlier in the summer, throwing a cover crop, bringing all the cows in, for instance, and using them for more fertilization because you can have them on the land longer. So it's definitely an option to break up and diversify more. But without that market, of course, you can't just grow a year and take a year off and just grazing those cows, you'd be losing money. But if you did them both, it really works, right? And so, just like down in the South, some areas have been specializing more in cotton and rice. And, in other parts of the country, they have specialties too. And so then looking at the Farm Bill, basically 6 of those specialized crops are the ones that get the primary amount, or the biggest amount of the subsidies through Title I of the Farm Bill, which is that program. It's supposed to be a safety net, but over time has more morphed to devalue the product through government subsidies, so it can go as a cheap feed into the mega livestock industry animal confinement systems, where we used to all have small herds on our farms typically, so we were more diversified because we were taking a chunk off and feeding them. And of course, Regenerate Nebraska, myself and many others are a big advocate for re-diversifying, so we're not so specialized in only 2 of the big crops that the Farm Bill says. Of course, there would be more of this if that was opened up and more crops and food grade crops were allowed to be in that mix as part of the subsidy program. And there's also supply management provisions that have been stripped away that save people money, taxpayers money, because we only trigger those payments when they're really needed instead of some of these blanket subsidies, when we have to be shouting for a long enough time because we're going broke.
Right. And, we touched about the Farm Bill in our first recording. So I'm going to repost that one as well, so folks can go back and kind of refresh before they dive into this one. You were just in Lubbock, and that's where you were down there. I found out, sent you to Class 1 barbecue on your way to Lubbock. What was going on in Lubbock that you're making that trip down there for?
Once again, that barbecue is excellent. Please go swinging through. That was a great suggestion. It's a cool family as well. I was on my way down for the American Ag Movement, and the American Ag Movement was started up in the 1970s in what we know historically as the farm crisis. And what you've seen then, there's a lot more family farmers out there But in Jimmy Carter's era as president, he put in a trade embargo on Russia, basically, maybe it's the Soviet Union at that time, basically, tariffing them out of us being able to export our products. So it led to a glut, created a lot of stirred up farmers, that started organizing at that time. And then when Ronald Reagan came in, raised the interest rates after farmers had a lot of debt and that already downturn, and then it drove hundreds of thousands of farmers off. And, you hear about the farm suicides and those kind of things. That was a really bad time. And that, of course, is the era that I grew up in. Now, a few of those old timers back then that led those tractors into Washington, D.C. and advocated for sound policies around these more efficient supply management techniques, they're still a part of that. And I like to go pay my respects to some of the people that I admire the most and learn from them about what solid policy looks like, so we can get back into articulate discussions about that instead of all the smoke screens going on in the world. So I'm very focused on that, and I try to stay focused on that. And so it's a learning lesson for me where I can go actually ask questions to some of the original people that I have the most amount of respect for. That was the last true stand of the family farmers, but they got beat back and whittled down. However, this year, I started to see more young farmers there. I was down there, I think about 4 or 5 years ago was the last time I was down there for this meeting. And there's a lot more young farmers. There was over 20 states represented of, different producers there, coming up and sharing how down in Florida or down in Arkansas or down in Georgia or up in Connecticut, there was issues with the farm policies that these specific folks did not do anything wrong, but got caught up in bad policy and, inevitably are in this downturn where they can't really diversify because there's no markets. And so they have to be along for the ride. And that's really scary right now. I want to make a real point here. Since the Nixon administration, Earl Butz was the Secretary of Agriculture, and he announced we were going to be more efficient on the farm. And that was a more precision and tech approach than more hands-on approach to the land. And so ever since then, in my opinion, every administration has essentially not got the job done for reform. We've taken steps back as the monopolies have gained more power. And at this time and at this point, with the tariff stuff that everyone's been hearing about, but maybe doesn't completely understand, that took an already fragile system from generations, 50 years of really bad policy objectives. And it essentially put people on the brink really fast. And so if you drive across the middle of the country, and this is definitely the same in our area, but some areas are probably even tougher to get their products out of the area and the elevators into market. You still see a ton of that corn and a ton of that beans in our area, and other crops in other respective areas piling up because the export markets were blown. And, I've had qualms about being so reliant on a Chinese market for years in soybeans, for instance. But this dismantled that market, and it was the largest market. And so now people, many farmers, especially if they're carrying over any debt, as a lot of farmers do, have their, shoulders to the blades and don't have a lot of other options. And so I was hearing a lot of that down in Lubbock, Texas, and it was very, very valuable perspective. And everybody is really, really concerned that the monopolistic pressures in meatpacking, in seed technology, and sales in agrochemicals, once again, as we talked about prior, tied to pharmaceuticals very closely now. They've all started to gouge us on prices. And I feel like our farm has had some of that, which has further ignited our energy towards, transition to more diversified options and trying to find markets out there across the country, across the United States, domestic markets, not always export markets overseas, that we can partner with, look our friend in the eye and have a real relationship again, which is something that I value, but has been missing for a long time in my part of the country.
Yeah, and so I think that, again, living on the West Coast, I think that we're pretty fortunate in the sense that we have a much closer connection to our farmers. I think that it feels like it's been happening a lot more because we have such a great population density. And then we have, with that population density, we have these chefs that are in magazines and newspapers, on TV, radio, film, etc., that are, really pumping, farmer, farmer, farmer. And so, we take for granted what exists in our place versus what's happening in the rest of the country. And what we don't really realize is the rest of the country's farmers really feed America. Like that middle part of America, like y'all are feeding America. It's not just, oh, Bob and Sally went to the farmer's market and they bought cabbage and peppers from, Groundworks Farms. It's, well, I'm still going to go home. I'm going to eat this cereal that I got at the supermarket. And, well, where did those grains come from? And where were they produced? And how were they produced? And how are we supporting those farmers that are growing the primary source of our food in America? What do you see as kind of a solution, a path to the solution, right? Is, for me, what my experience tells me is that chefs need to be talking more in these populated areas about these grains and different ingredients and how they're being used and why they're using them and where they're coming from. Is that something that can, happen for you guys in the middle of America where the populations are much more spread out? How can we in these densely populated areas be part of the solution to really screaming and helping create those domestic marketplaces?
I was just at last week, a conference in Norfolk, Nebraska, held by the Nebraska Sustainable Ag Society, who's also been around since the 70s, but are more focused on the diversification part. And so you had a whole bunch of thought leaders in there and some breakout sessions talking about, how we go about enabling diversification on the farms around more food products grown here. And so I was at the back room, raised my hand. I'm like, yo, we need to figure out how to develop markets. And like, we need some mills, not just corn, grain elevators for corn and beans, but to be able to unlock our potential of small grains. And like, there's nowhere I'm growing all these hazelnuts, but like, I'm going to pick them and, share them. But like, there's nowhere to go with things like that if we were to scale up. And so there will be conversations percolating in Nebraska about that. And I am going to try to be a part of those so that we can connect the farmer's angle about how we get that domestic access back to the markets. And that even includes things like transportation routes. So from point A to point B logistically, like for someone that's interested or entities that are interested in certain products, how do we create like those pathways of food products through domestic trade and sales? And we have essentially obliterated those domestic sales from the middle part of the country that are around food grade opportunities. So there's a disconnect. Those pathways have been cut off. And there's a lot of weird laws out there we can dive into. But the long story short is that we want to break down some of the bad laws and re-enable those domestic partnerships to further secure our areas and our country with good, solid food, and in the process, recreate commerce and more opportunities for young people to get back on the land, to want to experiment and do a bunch of different things, all while managing the land and more under those regenerative principles. We spend a lot of time on the first. So if there are markets or chefs or businesses or processors or whatever that are interested, grocery outlets that really look for clean products and like to know the farmer, we're going to be trying to essentially like map that out in the upcoming years and try to figure out how we start to stimulate some of that back and forth. And of course, always at the same time, simultaneously, we'll be advocating for programs that can help us be able to do some of that at both the federal and state levels. And there are efforts underway right now at the federal level that has a nice bipartisan feel to it in its inception. And that's around the food is medicine. Terms that you're hearing. And so there are legislative initiatives in S 2834 and HR 5439 that would help pilot a medically tailored home delivered meals program, for instance. So these things would help stimulate local markets. Of course, A lot of people may have heard of farm to school programs. Like, we want to actually preserve those. Those are in the Farm Bill and the nutrition program. They give us markets. I actually am an advocate of liking some of the changes for higher quality foods and some of the SNAP programs. I think that is a good pairing, and have seen, I've seen some other troubling things. I appreciate kind of the re-diagram of the food pyramid. These things are all like positives right now that we should be trying to embrace under the market development, but we should also be trying to figure out where we can connect different parts of the country who have these interests as we're starting to talk about this and look, beyond Nebraska for sales and trade. You guys are trying to figure out how to continue to diversify, what you're doing as a chef or in the supermarket. We have to find a way now to bring those kind of conversations together in the next 5 years so that more farmers and more young people have a chance to meet those demands. And without the consumers driving it initially, being well informed on these kind of conversations and saying, I deserve better in my life. I want to feel good and think clearly. We need that to be louder and louder. And I do appreciate you and others who are helping more people understand that we need to know the farmer again, and our relationship needs to be with the consumer. And as we've lost 40% of the profitability on the farmer's share of beef cattle, as an example, we want to gain that back by cutting up some of the middle folks that are too tied into the monopolies and dividing and developing the through lines for state, local, and regional domestic markets across this country.
That's I love that. I mean, the thing that in all that and unpacking all that information, that I think a lot of folks get caught in this idea of like, well, my voice doesn't really matter, right? The average consumer is kind of like, well, I need to do the thing that's the most affordable thing, or I need to do the thing that, I see on Instagram or on TikTok, and I've got to do that because that's what this influencer says, and that's, where this money's coming from. But I don't think that we realize how powerful our voice really is and how powerful our dollars really are in helping to really sustain what y'all are working towards achieving, especially with the changes in the Farm Bill and creating legislation that really supports that movement itself. I think the consumer gets so kind of blocked off by all these other what are perceived as giant issues that are existing in the country. The other thing too is, I think that what I heard in there is, connecting interstate commerce. And for me, I miss that piece of the puzzle, because again, like I don't see it as a chef or a consumer how much we've exported over time, and how little we actually communicate as states and sharing our bounty, if you will. And so I think that really focusing my attention towards that is going to be a really good thing, and I'm going to do my best to do so. When we talk about like small mills, when we export this stuff, how much of it is going to mills that don't even exist in America? So do we have many? I don't know of many grain mills in America anymore, even out here. Is that something that helps to build that commerce as well?
Yeah, the whole system's been essentially globalized, and Nebraska imports 90% of its food now, even though we can grow all these things, for instance. And so under that globalized nature, NAFTA was a big part of that. You could see a cow or a product hit several places, overseas before it hits our market here. And it could even start in the U.S. and circle around and then come back and traditionally would be considered product of the USA. Some of that's being cleared up right now through country of origin labeling, which is a great policy, returning transparency to the consumers. At least I hope. I think that's what was supposed to be going on right now, and so that's one thing that can help is restoring the transparency to the consumers so they can do it. But under the nature of this globalized system that just really took off and, in my opinion, went too far, we don't have a lot of that infrastructure here in the U.S. anymore, and so we need to rebuild it. And some of these are investments that can return the dollar through communities in our country over and over and over again. And it's just like once, we need to think of not like blanket subsidies or, funding for weird things that are political, but we need to invest in things that return dollar and restore communities. And of course, as a priority, always bring the young people back in that fray to be a part of that. And I'm not seeing this kind of a focus at the level that it needs to be at. So I'm hoping that we can reestablish that, as you start seeing more people, just by the nature of being fiscally pressed as farm businesses, be able to make some of those connections so that there's opportunities for them and their family, in the future to be a part of these solutions. And of course, I've mentioned to you before, it just feels better when you're part of solutions as part of your business than when it does when you're going through the motions, and I've been in both places, and I'm, glad that I made the turn. And I know a lot of other middle-aged young people who are looking to make some kind of a turn that just brings that meaning as well. So.
No, and that's a really cool outlook to it. And you mentioned middle age, and I just turned 45, so I feel like I can stand on my soapbox now and say, you young people, right? And so I like to think that I'm technologically literate, but I'm not. I can work in computer, I can use my iPhone, I can do all those things. What part is technology? Because I think that young people today, they have this great technological literacy. And with things like, we hear about like AI taking over this or taking over that, or, computers are the next wave. Is technology going to play a part in kind of engaging this next generation? Is that something that is being talked about amongst farmers? Is that something you guys are looking at? Is how does technology help us, connect to the next generation, but also improve our systems?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I really appreciate that. And the simple answer is yes, technology is already playing a part and will play a part more. The question is, how do we use and develop the technology? What for? What's the specific in-game goal here? So when I look at technology on our farm, I apply the 6 principles. Like, essentially, is the technology going to meet those 6 regenerative principles? And is the technology part of the healing process of the land, from getting to, what would be my dream vision, right? And so I want to use technology that enables that and makes us more efficient and using less resources, essentially, which is not necessarily the viewpoint of how a lot of the industry is using technology. For instance, Bill Gates, he and Jeff Bezos engineered these microbes that you coat on a seed coat when you plant it, and then they're supposed to be unlocked like as oxidation happens and fix nitrogen. And the idea is that you don't have to buy as much as synthetically produced nitrogen. So the starting point is good: less synthetic nitrogen, less nitrous oxide emissions, and so that's good. But like, we're engineering stuff with no precautionary principle and unlocking it, and we're not telling the farmers that this is biotechnology, not biologicals, because it's being termed as biologicals. So I'm worried about technologies like that. And so, we would do our research and look and try not to implement that on our farm, where others may not have done the research and think it's a typical biological, just like algae or, some kind of fungal based, like, a stimulant, biological stimulant that's natural, and get very confused on that. And so that's how deceptive to me that the industry can be. And they try to pass incentive bills based on nitrogen reduction in our waters around this at our state level. That's how they, be able to play that. However, we are able to see things in our fields in certain parts of the year when stuff's really tall and it's just really, really hot and tough to like get out in the middle of these places with drones. That'd be a good example of technology. We sprinkle our cover crop seeds earlier in the year while they're standing crops, like by using drones. This year we'll be one of the first farmers in the country to apply weed cutting robots. They don't look like robots. They look like little buses. They got like caterpillar tracks on them, and they'll crawl in between our rows, and just it's a lawnmower. It's a glorified lawnmower, and they're made for the rigorous element that they're in and the weather conditions. And they just crawl back and forth nonstop. And so I'll have an intern on my farm. This is a young gal that's going to ag school and goes to high school, and one of the neighbors here, she'll be helping us be able to deploy those systems this year. And And then we can also apply a biological, not a biotechnology, because we're not doing that on our farm, but a biological that can further stimulate things by night. We cut during the day, and that should be about a straight month and a half where we'll use technology to pull off a cycle of chemicals that we had used in the past. So, I have to measure these things by the principles, and will the soil be better? But at the same time, that it does have an AI component to it, those robots. And the other thing we're seeing here is that Omaha has approved all these data centers, and it's a strain on our water. We're getting tagged, the people that live in the Omaha metro area, with higher prices because they're not paying for the infrastructure. They're not putting solar on their rooftops, and so it's draining, the grid and creating reliability issues in the country around the periphery. In upcoming years, that's a real problem that we're concerned about. And so I'm not sure that the end game is going to be all AI if we're using these monstrosities of buildings that are sapping up all our resources for data and crypto and Bitcoin, and all of this stuff is going to cover the planet. I mean, so what's the end goal here? Those things have to turn into more chip size, those data centers, to make this work. And I want to see something as the middle game here that works, so more farmers have opportunities to do what with those robots. But right now, there's no standard set, and this is going to get out of control really fast. And without some safeguards or rails, there will be people that will try to use these for other purposes that aren't as good. And I'm already seeing that on the big agricultural scale, where some of the same concepts in technology would be used for different purposes, and I think may save the farmers, but may incent some money, but may incent some of them to do things that are more destructive, do not fit in the regenerative principles. But that's how we have to decipher, technology. I'd also say we have water probes under the ground, so if we need to sprinkle when it's dry with irrigation, we know exactly where it's at according to the root level estimate. It's way more efficient. So there's a lot of good technology. There's bad technology, and we need to have some standards and some rails there on policy wise, but people also need to use good judgment on these scenarios. And we're trying to do it by following the regenerative principles, which is our, guiding part as a farmer.
That's wild. And I hadn't really thought about it until you put it into that context for me. And from the outside looking in, I can see where it seems that these folks that kind of control the capital in America are creating, these technologies that are ultimately taking up a ton of land, sucking up a ton of resources, and not consulting with the people actually on the ground. So, we're taking these really bright minds and we're saying, oh, we can do this, and this is going to be great, and it's going to change everything, and immediately implementing without actually going and saying, hey, Graham, how do you think that this is going to impact actual soil quality? How do you think this is going to impact crop growth? How do you think this is going to impact the overall health of the soil and the earth? So we've got a problem where people that think that I should rephrase that. Folks that have really beautiful, bright ideas are not consulting with people on the ground doing the actual work, seeing how these ideas are being implemented. And it seems that if there was a way to get those two things together, we could really see a benefit in this technology versus what you're describing and what I see from the outside looking in as this really destructive reality that's coming way quicker than we're realizing. I don't think that, when I use ChatGPT for a menu or to clean up a recipe, I don't see the result being that it's a 1 million square foot data center in Prineville, Oregon, that's sucking up a ton of water to cool these systems so they don't overheat. And, that's just me. That's just one person, let alone everybody utilizing this technology blindly, not seeing the actual impact. And so I think that that's another piece of the puzzle too, is how do we convince folks that their everyday activity impacts such a greater thing, right? And I guess that gets back to the general consumer not realizing that their everyday dollar impact at the grocery store impacts across the country. We really are in this feast or famine state as consumers where, oh, well, this is what I need. And we've kind of stopped looking at okay, what do we need? The we piece of it. And I think that's one thing that, in hearing you talk about this gal that is an intern who is a neighbor who's in high school, who's going to ag school to become better, to help this world be better. Like, that community aspect is something that in our densely populated areas we don't get. We have folks that are living in skyscrapers that don't know their neighbor down the hall, let alone know their farmer, 30 miles outside the city. And so,
it would take that away from us too, but like, they're in generational family farm and they're good people as well. And so I'm glad this is working out because, first and foremost, they've like given a lot to the community. And so you want to also have those opportunities, for them. And you hope that they will bring some of that, back, to our area, and our area starts to be a more solidified, a community on more solid ground together, deploying all kinds of creative ideas rather than just kind of following the land grant institutes, that are trying to re-engineer things for companies that are looking for quick profit, when, we really need to be going back to the fundamentals and working within the ecosystem instead of trying to re-engineer it all. So, these are complexities for sure, but if we can just think about that one regenerative principle of ecosystem context and how it's like not for us to re-engineer, what God's put here to provide for us. It's us to work within that. And in order for us to be successful of doing that, it's got to be a we thing. And these kind of conversations are vital, to helping us be able to turn the corner together. I don't like the cutthroat mentality. I don't like what's becoming this country where there's two sides pointing fingers at each other. We need each other to make this work. And everybody was born here because they got something to give, I don't know what it is. It's a self exploratory mission for each one of us to figure that out. We don't always all nail it, but we need to enable that because we complement each other. We're one life species on this planet, and this planet hosts us, and it only works if we're more compatible with everything else that's living with us too. So that has to be the mentality we change to. That we thing is vital. And if we start getting better at that, and we have a heck of a foundation because there's a lot of that out there already. But if we start getting better at that, the sky's the limit for how more of us can live together more efficiently and more healthy. And I do believe that there's something to be said for that construct of a future vision.
That warms my heart. It gives me that hope that I love to hear. It's always that hope that you share in your vision. Is one of the things I really respect and adore about what you're doing, and you as a human being, is you don't ever have this deep doom. You always are looking for a solution. You're constantly talking about the hope and the possibilities that we really have in this world. And I really appreciate that you are doing that. I love having these conversations because it keeps me focused on that. As we're talking through that, I'm thinking to myself, like, one of the things is, TikTok. I'm not on TikTok. I don't know how TikTok works. Social media kind of gets me, but that's the next generation of people. Is there kind of a movement within farms to, with lack of a better term, like make farming sexy, right? Because it's, I think that we have all these false idols that exist on the internet and influencers, and they go out and they do these outrageous things, and that's what grabs attention, versus having content created specifically to say, look, like, this is what the Christensens are doing on their farm right now, and this is why it's so cool to see what this final product really is. And this is, where the sorghum to the cereal to my bowl to my health, like, is there movement within the agriculture industry to kind of like figure out how to create content like that? Or
I think so, yeah. I'm not on TikTok either. I do use a lot of the other social channels, but I am definitely seeing that. And the conference event, that once again, Nebraska Sustainable Ag Society, I think they're doing a good job of that by bringing in, all these other opportunities that people can implement, diversity. Regenerate Nebraska was developed exactly for this, to be able to connect farmers, consumers, and meatpacking workers. We've been told we're in different sectors. We are part of the same, in my opinion. And so you see all these severances, disconnects, urban communities, rural communities, and tribal communities. Same thing. We've been severed, and I hear people point fingers at their urban, neighbors and the urban people, freaked out about what's going on in the country, and like, let's get together, So Regenerate Nebraska whole goal is to bring together those severed triangles that have been like dismantled, probably intentionally along the way, to keep us from doing things like a lot of what we're talking about. And it's also to appeal to young people in all of these communities, no matter who they are, because we want people whose hearts like love food and the diversity and the things that you can bring forth and grow that heal. We want those people like to be farming in our communities in the future. We've lost all these family farms and young people. Those are our future people. And so that's what Regenerate Nebraska is really seeking to do, is to create like a way more positive vision. And hopefully, if we do a good job, create more inroads for more people to be part of these solutions. And it's tricky, just in the nature of the way our country is. But I will say on the ground level, there's a ton of momentum around that. Is definitely growing every single year. And it appeals to all young people at all ages. When I talk to them in their schools, you'd be surprised at the people who want to become farmers or be a part of regenerative agriculture, which could be bees, or it could be processing hazelnuts, or making like clean biologicals, out of like, rotten wood chips and, just stuff like that, that there's all of these things that we could be doing. And when you talk about it like that, and, even bring some good food and some arts in the equation, there's people want to be a part of that. And so we have to be able to enable that. And I think that the positive vision is better reflective than kind of the industry message, which, got people kind of walking in a line talking about how they're feeding the world. Meanwhile, they're not growing even one apple tree, on their place. And I'm just like, okay, we can do better here than that message. And my experience is that's very appealing. I'm clearly seeing signs in the interior of the country of growing momentum. And now we got to connect some of the dots to capture that momentum. And now is a good time for that based on those things.
What an awesome vision. I love that, breaking down the barriers and kind of, what you're talking about there is, and so I'm a bit of a conspiracy theorist myself. I think that there's been quite a bit of design to keep the industries that really coexist together separated, specifically to be able to kind of manage prices and overall control. But that's a whole nother podcast topic. One of the things that you hit on is breaking down those barriers and, showing people how symbiotic your relationships really are and how important it is to continue growing that. Like, what would be an example of connecting a beef rancher and for instance, what you guys are doing at Christensen? What does that symbiotic relationship look like?
Well, I would just say that through part of the Regenerate Nebraska project is to allow people to be aware of just what's going on within their state or around the close proximity, because people have no idea that there's 1,000 farmers out there that are doing really, really incredible like things. It gets kind of glossed over in that mix. And so we try to enable the understanding that this is out there through that network, for example. And then when we hear of a young person, for instance, that has an interest in one area, we kind of know like who is out there that's excelling like in that area. And then we can set up like a little trips to be able to acclimate folks. Sometimes it's led to internships or like, even jobs and opportunities like that. So it's connecting the dots, and we're kind of this project is all about bridging and connecting those dots because we need that talent out there. Once again, there's a big music event that was in Minneapolis this year called Farm Aid. So we wanted to have some folks like be in that atmosphere, and go be in good music, be around good food, but then be around conversations that are going on, nationwide. We'll send young people and scholarship them to go to DC to have a chance to meet with, their representatives in person, because oftentimes we see a lot of these people whose hearts are in the right place don't have the through line so that their voice can like truly be heard in person like that, or to be able to go learn about how the United States Department of Agriculture works, and make connections with the folks in there that are essentially the bureaucrats that are refining the policies that the politicians pass. And so all of these things are ways that we're trying to connect the dots, make sure more voices are heard, make sure there's more education continuously going on. And then people that typically wouldn't have, but really love these kind of concepts are getting to meet those who have excelled in these areas that do exist out here. So that's pretty awesome. And that only stimulates more new creative thinking and more relationships that can create entrepreneurial opportunities. So we're playing a long game on this deal, and that's kind of work we'll have to continue to go on, and it's very fun and rewarding, and I mean it's just I think it's going to yield a lot more opportunity as we continue to use that model down the road for more people.
I love it. And what I'm hearing through this is that there are significant opportunities in the entrepreneurial space in agriculture, and I think that we don't hear enough about that. I think that a lot of young folks today, or the folks that are 14 to 25, that would be like a prime entrepreneur, they're hearing about like go to technology, go to the internet, do something on the websites, but we aren't really celebrating the entrepreneurship that exists in agriculture. And it's so good to hear that there are all these opportunities, and I think that there are just a plethora of opportunities in entrepreneurship, just, from the very, from something that you don't even have to go out and plant, but figure out how to mill grains that are being grown 5 miles from your property, right? Like, there are opportunities. And I think at the federal level, finding ways to fund or grant that kind of entrepreneurship is a great way to continue to diversify our marketplaces, but also get the consumers more involved and more local to their food. I struggle here. Fishing is my big thing. In Oregon, we only eat 20% of the fish that's caught off the Oregon coast is eaten in Oregon. We export 80% of our fish.
Yeah.
And that to me is, what you're talking about with importing 90% of Nebraska's food. It's the same thing, just in a different place. It's a different, people might look at it as like, oh, well, that's fish and that's protein and that's important. But like, people don't talk about it nearly loudly enough. And I'm trying to scream it as loud as I can, because it is so important that we understand that we're not feeding America. Like we're feeding outside of these places. And in doing so, we're starving the people that are growing our food of an opportunity to enrich their lives. So knowing that there are entrepreneurial opportunities in ag and in food, if you're young and you're hearing this, find out where you can get involved. And a great place to start is Regenerate Nebraska, and getting plugged in and connecting with other young people who want to do these things, and it really pushing the we aspect of it.
Imagine if we each got 10% back of that market, how many local economies would be stimulated just from that? And so like, it's a starting place, right? We're not asking for it all. Never have advocated for the elimination of export markets, but when it's so highly unbalanced, so tilted in one direction, it's not secure and safe as it should be, and we're missing opportunities. So for starts, like, I just want to advocate that we make this 80-20. We get 10% of that back. And let's see like how much stimulation happens with that. It'd be positive. And I think that more people then would have more inroads to be able to potentially do more and more. And because it'd be a positive experience for almost everybody. And I know the monopolies won every single last acre for this or that. But to your point, we're lacking deficiency of nutrition in our own country. So we're skipping right over. And that's why I don't believe in the feed the world model, because we're not even feeding ourselves good nutrition first. We need to start that way, and we'll have an abundance and we'll be able to export with partners. But like, we need to like work from the inside out, and just in the wild world, like it's all about security too. So
yeah, no, it's you nailed it. What do you have going on this year that's going to be new on the farm from last year? What kind of crops are you growing? That aside from the sorghum, we got the sorghum. What else you guys got going on?
So this year I'm going to learn with a couple of friends how to graft trees. And so, for instance, in Omaha, I know I call it the apple tree of life because it's like there's this just some bigger farm acreage areas that kind of got engulfed by the city, but they have the natural ground. And we found this apple tree, and I literally like 5-6 years ago brought one of these apples back to my dad, and he ate it. He was just like, "Oh, this reminds me of when I was a kid eating apples." Like, I mean, that's like powerful, right? And so we just like glean this neighbor's apples. He's a cool guy. He lets us, a former superintendent of a area high school. And so we go glean his apples. This year, I'm going to cut some of that off and graft it onto another apple tree stock with a friend. He's going to show me how to do it. Sounds pretty simple, but I just kind of need to go through the motions and see if I can replicate some of those apples. So that's one of the exciting things we're doing. We will also be focusing on a western front of our property and developing an additional tree line or kind of shelter belt to stop the intensity of the western winds that come in, which bring a lot of dust, just a lot of havoc to the inner areas of our trees and some of our like orchard areas. But we'll outline that also to stop some of the chemical drift, because we continue to see chemicals that are applicated on soybeans like dicamba have a creepy nature where they idle and then they get up when the weather conditions are right, move like a snake and burn some of my fruit trees. This problem's going on all over the state of Nebraska now for those that are trying to branch off. So this is a real huge issue. But my first line of defense will be a gritty row of cedar trees. And on the inside, I'll have some Osage oranges, which are good for hedgerows, like fake fence, kind of. It's what our ancestors in the plains just to the south of us used, and the deer love them. So we could use a few more deer in our areas, and so they'll be good. And I heard they also can bring like voles and other varmints, so they'll be clear away from where we live, off on that distant hedgerow as that first line of defense. And we already planted 2 other trees around the shelter belts that are aging. For a second line of defense, we have the primary third line of defense. So this is going to be the front line of defense, and we're kind of doing it backwards. But that's just how it evolved, through our time. And that's a fun project. We'll also mix in some new oak trees that we'll plant, and tulip trees, which are native to Nebraska, are super pretty. Wanted to add a little flowering color like around the area. So we'll have some big flowering trees that are great for birds and pollinators that we'll be adding in to, just like I said, add that color.
I have to look that up.
Hybrid hazelnuts and chestnuts that were designed to try to eliminate some of the blight issues that the more traditional American hazelnuts and chestnuts, which are native to this area. This year I'll be planting the American hazelnuts and the American chestnuts, so I can start to learn how they really react, in this modern time, since a lot of them, have been obliterated and aren't there anymore. And also one of my indigenous friends, who's also a chef, probably a guest you should have, Chef Anthony Warrior. He focuses on indigenous products for indigenous young people and communities. And he's always asking what native species I have growing on, and if he can glean them. And I have some, but I want to do more, and I want to see if these work. And so we'll have a fun experiment coming up, and those are kind of some of those other big projects outside of the sorghum, which is a shift for us, and going back into a food grade bean cycle.
That's so awesome. Hey, I got to ask, how are the birds doing? Because last time we talked,
bird species,
yes,
the woodpecker around this year, and the pheasants, they've been coming back. So we definitely have seen that around our place, and that's the key one. That's the key indicator for us, probably in our area, is the pheasants. I think last spring when I took a walk around, I got that bird app that you can turn it on and it records the different kinds of birds that are chirping around, and then it lists them, and then I can learn more about them. So I'm learning with that app. I love that app. But I think I got like 15 species on one walk last year in the spring, which is super cool. I'm excited to continue to try to give them more areas. I know the prairie crab apples I planted last year are big draws for birds, and they're kind of off on the edge of the place because I won't use the crab apples as much, but they'll love them, and they'll flower pretty along kind of some of our roads too. So That was something I did last year along with Pawpaws, were another addition last year. And but yeah, we're starting to see some birds, a lot of turkeys. Always got some turkeys kind of around the area. They've remained pretty prolific, but I'm just trying to give them more habitat to kind of get back around our farm place a little bit within reason, because our dogs are wild. They love to chase things off the place, but they're kind of trained to do it too. So
Right. Man, I think that's one of the things. Gosh, there are so many things that I love about what you're doing. But for me, to see wildlife return to an area that otherwise didn't have it, that to me is just so amazing. Because I think that, again, as the average American, we don't appreciate the wilderness that can exist in places that may not be perceived as such a wild place. Like where I work in the Frank Church Wilderness, Idaho, it's wild. We're talking about 8,000 foot mountains down to a sea level valley. But places like the Plains, South Dakota, North Dakota, Nebraska, they get kind of left in the well, that's farmland. It's not wild. Well, it was wild. It was wild for a long time, and to hear people bringing back that wild to these places is just, it warms my heart, and it gets me all excited. And that to me, that's one of the really top 5 beautiful things that you're doing is recreating that. I want to talk to Chef Anthony Warrior, because I read a book this year called Why Some Like It Hot, and the author talked about the correlation, like can we change our genes through nutrition and eating? And one of the things he really hit home with is eating traditional foods from the places that our ancestors are from. And so, there are projects in Hawaii, there are projects in New Mexico where indigenous folks are eating these traditional ancestral diets and seeing health markers literally disappear from things like heart disease, high blood pressure, obesity, diabetes. And there's so much to that. And I am not a chef that has that experience with ancestral eating, but
you
sounds
guys
like
would
the
love
kind of
each other. And then there's the guy up in Minneapolis, Sean Sherman. Maybe you read a little bit about him, but he's also got the Sous Chef's Indigenous Kitchen Cookbook. So we have that here. And so I recommend that to check in. And he really paved the way. Unfortunately, they got some issues, I guess, within the last few days. One of their employees got taken by ICE. We're in Minneapolis. We're in a hot spot. So they have no idea where this person went. Another person needs medication. So, just there's a lot of things going on here in the world, but and I know Sean's dealing with that, but that dude's a good dude and is a tremendous leader for that exact topic. And Chef Warrior is he's doing it here in Nebraska, and also teaching at the Nebraska Indian Community Colleges, like on a mission to try to get young people to know like what their native diets like actually were like. And then he prepares the food for the students that come through there. But if I got any chance to hire him, we try to hire him to cater like events so that we're drawing the connection to more people. So they're taking it to the next level, of what we're doing on our farm. And Chef Warrior like brings that full circle. And you guys, I know, will just like absolutely like hit it off. So I'm going to plan on making that connection for you.
Well, that's our job as chefs, right? And chefs, if you're listening, your job is to connect the circle, right? Like we are the place, the person, the connector that brings us all together, right? Because we can bring Graham with Keen out in Port Orford and take fish and grains and put them on a plate and have our guests, the consumer, experience this and say, oh, this is the full cycle. And so knowing that you're connecting within those people, and again, like it all comes down to we, right? And then hearing you talk about collaborating and learning with your friends on how to graft trees, like we don't do that as a general society, as a general public. We're like, oh, I know everything, or oh, I can't learn that. Well, ask a friend, go do something with a friend. And that's where these great ideas, that's where the collaboration really begins. And we start to see this growth and the change happen. I love this Apple idea. I love fruit trees, and so we planted two more after we talked last year. I found a cherry tree that has 4 different varieties of cherries grafted onto one tree, and then I found an apple tree that has 4 different varieties of apple grafted on the one tree. So I'm really excited. I think this year will be the year that I really get some good fruit out of our little, our little quarter acre here. And
that quarter acre is beautiful. It'll come right back to life.
Yeah, I'm so excited for it. And where can we learn? Where I'm going to keep pushing people to Regenerate Nebraska, and I'll get some other. I'm going to get some other links from you as well, because I think that kind of linking at the bigger picture as well would be good for folks to be able to do some of their own research and dig into what we talked about here today. And Graham, thank you so much for making time for me. I really appreciate this. Like, men like you are changing the world, whether you see it or not. We're making a difference. Keep pushing, and I'm going to keep doing my part to spread the good word and make food accessible and pretty, and we got to make farming sexy again. We're gonna do it. I'm excited to see what happens here, and again, thank you for sharing your experience with us, man.
IMSA, make farming sexy again. IMSA.
IMSA. I'm gonna write that down. Make. Right. Well, it's gonna be the next TikTok thing where we see kids dancing in fields. Yeah, maybe that's what we do.
I would love to see that, though, and like I said, anything we can do in our generation to open up the pathways for the young people to come back and regenerate that land again, and is that's, I know that's part of my role here, on this trip, through life, and I can't wait to see more of that come to fruition.
Heck yeah, brother. Well, congratulations on all things. Thank you for sharing your story and getting us further involved. I look forward to our next conversation, my man.
Look forward to it too.
Good to see you today, brother.
Chef Garrett.
That's it for this episode of Here From Where. Thanks for tuning in, and if you enjoyed the conversation, be sure to subscribe and leave a review. A huge thanks to Justin Pitaleski for the music and sound production, and until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep moving forward. All the best, and happy cooking.